And this is all about how to evaluate sample size for stats. And first of all, we are interested in how often does a stat trigger. And for triggering, I mean that how often do we get an opportunity to see something on a stat. And as we have already discussed, VPIP and PFR are great stats when they trigger almost every hand, and you can get reliable data really quickly. And 3-bet triggers, depending on game, usually about twice in an orbit. We saw that it did trigger on the sample size with Pennytooth, they triggered 3 times in an orbit. And steel stats will trigger more often in 6 max tables than 9 max tables. So you'll also need to understand the standard structure you are playing and how many players there are on table. The less players there are on table, the more likely on late position it is that you get an opportunity to steal. So, and observe your opponents like we did, that if you can't get sample size on the players you have most hands on, you definitely do not need that stat. And if you can't get sample size on average reg, you probably don't need that stat. And overvaluing a stat that is not reliable will lead to bad decisions. Like if you are going to that, I am going to 3-bet this guy when we have played 100 hands and he's supposed to 3-bet his 100. So I'm going to 3-bet him with 7-3 off since he always folds. If you shouldn't make decisions on before your stats are reliable, how will you know what sample size is enough? The bigger the differences you are going to need, the less hands you are going to need. For example, if there is a player that's played like 70% of hands in early game 9-handed for 20 hands, you can quite likely say that he's playing too loose for the game. Okay, there will be chance that he's going to be a 11 percentage player, but just having great cards. But there are always going to be confidence intervals on like how often is player going to be around the number. And generally you can know some kind of a confidence intervals. Like usually it's going to be a cone shape that most of the players are going to be quite close to the stat, but they might be quite far away depending on the sample size. And also generally the closer to 50% the stat is expected to be, the larger the intervals will be. And okay, let's take some real life examples on confidence intervals. If we have only 5 samples and our real rate would be 30%, our 95% confidence interval is that our opponent with 95 confidence will be between 0 to 70%. So with 5 samples, we can say that with a high certainty, we know almost nothing on our opponent. When we are going down with it, like after 100 samples, if we have 30% showing on someone, we can see that with 95% certainty he's going to be between 21 and 39%, which is going to be quite good, since it's going to be quite likely that he's going to be like 70% likely that he's going to be just between 25 and 35, and even 25% that are going to be farther away are not going to be problems. And with 1000 samples, 95% confidence interval is about 3% difference, but for 30% real rate, and with 70% interval is going to be around 1.5%. So with 1000 samples, we can be really close to an opponent's real strategy. And with 5000 samples, we can be within 1 percentage point with 95% certainty. So for a stat, if we want to be really clear that opponent is really close to something, we'll need to have 5000 samples. Not fun. So it's not going to happen often. And this is also something that stats are usually going to be educated guesses rather than completely accurate representations of range in a certain situation. Then we can also take a look on confidence intervals for different real rates. If we have 100 samples, with 30% real rate, we saw that it was like 21 to 39%. If the real rate is only 5%, the confidence intervals would be like 0 to 9%. If we are having 10% real rate, so we can see that the closer to 50% rate we are getting, the wider the margins are going to be on either side. So stats like 3-bet that are quite close to 5 to 10%, they are going to be reliable stats more quickly than stats that are close to 50%. One example might be folding big blind to small raise, for example. That's usually quite close to 50% in the game. So, and it's symmetrical. So a stat that has a 5% real rate, the confidence intervals will be really similar to a stat that has 95% real rate. So then it would just be 91 to 100%. And if we are thinking about different confidence intervals, like if we are having 100 samples and the 30% would be the real rate, our 50% confidence interval would be 27 to 33%. So if we have 100 samples on someone, we can say that our educated guess is going to be that he's going to be within 3% of his real range. And if we want to have 75% confidence, it's going to be like 25 to 35%, still quite close. And we can see in here how it changes. And as we already know, it's going to be 21 to 39% on 95% confidence. And 90% confidence going to be really close to 95% confidence. And if we are having 10 samples, for 10 samples, we can still have like, if we have a 30% real rate, the 50% confidence interval would be to 20 to 40%. So if we have 10 samples on someone, we can say that our educated guess is going to be that we are going to be within 10% of his real range. And that's why if we are having someone with, let's say that he's playing with VPIP 50 and we think that the regs that are playing with the highest VPIP and are winning are around 20 VPIP, we can mark a player that, okay, we might want to play against this guy even when we have only 10 samples on him, since we can know that with 70% confidence interval, he's going to be between 35, around between 35 and 65. And of course, when we are seeing with 10 samples with 95% confidence intervals, it would be 1.6% to 58%. So like with 10 samples, we don't have high confidence of having pretty much any idea on our opponent, but we can use our stats to do educated guesses even after 10 samples. But pretty much as we see that even our educated guess with 50% confidence interval on 10 samples will be 10% difference, then we'll see that practically we are going to need at least 10 samples if a player is not really far away from what would be profitable in a certain spot.